The Market Revolution, 1820 to 1860, Chapter 9. Now, I promised you a shorter lecture this time, and it's going to be shorter, but if you've checked ahead, you'll see there's an awful lot of slides. But then there's an awful lot of picture slides, and there's only one YouTube at the very end. If you haven't already printed out that little document called the Factors Leading to the Market Revolution, I suggest that you do. It'll make taking notes a lot easier, because although I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 items listed there, it's going to be the way the lecture is going to go. Now, I'd be the first one to say that routine is good, and I like routine. It makes me feel more comfortable. But every now and then, you get a little bored with routine, and you need to do something to shake stuff up. So although I'm covering everything in the chapter, you will not be able to take the text and follow me that way. But if you've got this little listing with spaces between them, it gives you room for your notes, and each section it breaks it down as to what I'm going to be talking about. So take it easy and make it easy on yourself. So what are we talking about? We're talking about major economic transformation, expansion of people producing for the market, changing what they are producing and how they are producing it. It's a completely new mindset. It's revolutionary. So what actually led up to the market revolution? And this is where you'll get most of your information. I've got like this. You've got the specialization of labor. You've got early industrialization, transportation and communication revolution, westward expansion, the rise of the cotton kingdom, immigration and migration, government supported business, and I added one called the second awakening, which is not on this listing. Okay, beginning. Specialization of labor. What is outwork? What is the factory system? And what are the Lowell Waltham mills? Now, these are 3 questions that's going to be answered under the specialization of labor. Samuel Slater. Oh, he looks like a benevolent little grandfather, doesn't he? Actually, he was born way back, actually before the Revolution. He's what we call an early American industrialist, and he was called the father of the American Industrial Revolution. Actually, Andrew Jackson gave him that title. He's also called the father of the American factory system, but in England, he's called Slater the Traitor. Slater the Traitor. You see, he brought British textile technology to America, and then he modified it for our use. And he had learned the textile business when he was young at a business industry in Britain. When he came to the United States at the age of 21, he designed his own first textile mills. Later, he goes into business for himself and developed a long-line family business for he and his family. He eventually had 13 spinning mills, and he developed tenant farms and company towns around his textile mills in Rhode Island. He became a very, very wealthy man. The Lowell Waltham system. It's a first dual-purpose textile plant in a place called Francis Cabot Lowell's little town in 1814. Now, Mr. Lowell had gone to Great Britain in 1811, and he saw how well the British textile industry was doing. And although he was unable to buy drawings of the models of the new power looms, he studied them and memorized them, and when he returned home, he hired a master mechanic, whose name is Paul Moody. You don't need to remember that, to help him recreate what he's seen and start developing his own textile mills. This is what they call Lowell Town. Whenever you do something and cause the population to come in and build up towns around the water where he's going to have his textile mills. This is just a drawing, pen and ink of drawing of the mill itself. Now, I told you there'd be a lot of pictures. Now, the early textile mill loom floor, as you can see, women are being hired. Can you imagine? Look at the way this girl's dressed in the long dress and the stockings. I mean, you don't see any windows either. It's got to be hot and unpleasant to work, but then we women are used to things like that. Here's a blow-up drawing of what the early textile mill looked like. Early industrialization, your second title. It begins in England as early as the 1780s, and all that was underway in the 1790s here, it doesn't really get to growing until the 19th century, the 1800s. Mechanization, standardization, interchangeable parts. 3 things that are going to be necessary to begin industrialization. As you can see, this is New England. You can see Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And see, the largest cycle represents 3,000 employees. Look here. They're all along the coast in the New England area. By 1830, New England was very definitely the textile center. Didn't mean to do that. They became very dominant. This is in a matter of a decade or so. As you can see, it's all up in through here is where the massive growth is. There's very little. This is the breadbasket area. This is where they spend more on farms. We start to see a little bit here in Kentucky, not very much in Virginia. Tennessee, some. But you'd think it'd be more through here because this is where they grow the cotton, but they don't mill it that much in here. They grow it here in the south and then they ship it to the north. Starting from Mr. Lowell. Well, as I said, he was a very fatherly figure. He tried his best to, I think this is supposed to represent what he would do is because you need workers to work in these factories. Now, who better to work than a woman? Because a woman, well, she's, she takes orders, she does what she's told, and she works cheaply. And number two, she's got very small hands, so she can work on these delicate machines. So what he would do, he'd go out to the New England farms and find people who had girls, because we all know girls are useless on a farm. You need strong men to help you on a farm. So you can only hope to maybe have one girl to help mom in the kitchen, and the rest of the girls are just useless. So he made propositions, and he said, let me have your daughter, 16, 17, 18 years old, and I'll take her to where we have the factory, and we'll call them Lowell Girls, and they're going to be working in my factory. And the typical profile, well, they're going to live in boarding houses, and they're going to be very tightly controlled when they go to church. They can't have anybody above the first floor. They have to take turns doing the maintenance work and the cleaning, and I'll see that they're taken care of and paid. And oh, by the way, I'll even send you part of their money that they earn. So, I mean, it's a win-win situation for a family that's got girls. They get the girl that's useless out of the house. We get some money coming in. She has something to do to learn how to do things until she comes back and gets married. Boarding house life was very rigid and controlled. Along comes Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, which we'll get more into in just a minute. But we want to remember Eli Whitney for something called interchangeable parts. He came up with the idea. He said, before this time, if you had a gunsmith make you a gun, say in Philadelphia, and then you took the gun and you went to St. Louis and the gun broke and you had to go all the way back to Philadelphia to have it fixed because only the man that made it could fix it. So he comes up with an idea. If we standardize the making of guns and rifles and things like this, then if a gun is made in Philadelphia and it winds up in St. Louis and it breaks down, the man in St. Louis can find the part that's needed because all the guns have the same parts. And it was a revolutionary idea, interchangeable parts. Of course, this hurts the artisan because now the artisan, once he makes the rifle, anybody can work on it, not just him. So it's an upside for you and I as a customer, a downside for the man who makes the rifle. But interchangeable parts didn't stay with just rifles. It would spread to other types of machinery. And then, of course, we've got Elias Howe and Isaac Singer, which invented the sewing machine. And I personally have a Singer sewing machine, although it doesn't look like that. John Deere and the steel plow, which made plowing so much easier. You didn't have the wooden plow. You had a horse with it, and that steel plow, it could just go right through that dirt like it was butter. McCormick and the mechanical reaper in 1831. No longer do you have to go out in the field and do it yourself. You've got a machine to pull behind a horse that can do it. All these interventions and innovations are just coming like gangbusters. And along with the innovations, you've got transportation and communication revolution. It had previously been very, very expensive to transport goods. That's why if you didn't live on a river to transport, you couldn't go very far. You had bad roads and few connecting rivers. It cost as much to ship something in the United States from one state to the other as it would ship it to England. Enter steamboats. And once you had steamboats, you can not only go downriver, like you could on a flatboat, you could go upriver. And they started digging canals. And the roads were improved by the state. And then they entered railroads, which made it even cheaper to transport. And Samuel Morse invented the telegraph in 1830s, which meant that you would know when something was coming. You didn't just have to guess. The Cumberland National Road went from Maryland all the way to St. Louis. And you start seeing transportation from one side of the country to the other, which is good. The Conestoga covered wagon, as you can see, the trail isn't very long from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. So you're just going from Pennsylvania, all the way over to the other side of Pennsylvania. We really think, when we think of the Conestoga covered wagon, we think of the pioneers moving west in it, but it was really used for transport of goods. And the Erie Canal, one of the most famous. When we were kids in grade school, we used to sing about yo ho ho ho, pulling along the Erie Canal. Now, let me show you here. This is this is a canal. This is a waterway. And you see this team of horses is actually pulling this flatboat. We're not depending upon wind or steam at this point in time. In 1817, you pulled on the canal. Then Robert Fulton invents the steamboat in 1807, and this changed the way we transported goods. I mean, like I said, now you can go upriver as well as downriver. And canals are being built all over the place, as you can see. I want to point this out. A little place called Evansville. It's in Indiana, right on the Ohio River, and right across from Evansville is a place called Henderson, Kentucky. And if you go to the east 32 miles, you come to a place called Owensboro, Kentucky. And that's where I was born. Not in 1840. But from Lake Erie, where you transported goods in, all the way down through Indiana. And Indiana was a great growing state. They have the best cantaloupe I've ever eaten. As you can see, look where they are. You don't see anything down here in the lower part of Kentucky or Virginia or Tennessee, North Carolina. Where's the canals in the South? Because there are not any. As you can see, freight rates from 1785 to the Civil War are just going straight downhill. I mean, the biggest one, the upstream river rates are going to drop because you no longer have to pull and have the cost of the horses. You've got steam. But then, of course, you still got those big clipper ships that you've got to get stuff all the way to California, and the only way to do that is on a clipper ship down around South America. Oliver Evans. He was born in Delaware in 1755. And when he was 16 years old, he was apprenticed out to a wheelwright. But within 2 years, this man's brain was going gangbusters. He began working on something called a high-pressure steam engine. As a matter of fact, he's going to pioneer the high-pressure steam engines. He's going to also invent textile industrials and their tools and milling equipment. And in 1782, he built the first automatic mill on Red Clay Creek. And I think we've got a picture of that. Yeah, first automatic flour mill. He became one of America's pioneering inventors. He also created the high-pressure steam engine and advanced the milling industry by automating the flour mills, of which, like I said, we have a drawing right here. The Iron Horse. That's the affectionate name we gave the first railroad. In 1830, we had 13 miles of track built by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And in short, 20 years later, we had 9,000 miles of track, and 1 decade later, over 31,000 miles. We went on a building street for railroad tracks like you would not believe. And here again, look, Charleston's got one that goes over. I can't tell for sure where this is, but it looks like it's somewhere in Tennessee. Yeah. You have a couple coming down from New Orleans and going back up. See, what would that be? Would that be Biloxi, maybe? I don't know. We did one across Florida, but we just don't have that many railroads down here in the South because most of our plantations are growing stuff. They're on rivers anyway. But look up here to the northeast and the growing industrial city of Chicago. And as pointed out, immigrant labor built the North railroads, where in the South, slaves. And we couldn't really afford to let our slaves go out there and work on the railroads. We wanted them to do our cotton. Also, at the same time, Mr. Morse invents the telegraph, which now makes I can send a message to tell you that I've got something on a steamboat coming. It should arrive in 2 or 3 days instead of sending it by maybe Pony Express and you get it 2 weeks later and you don't know when the stuff's going to arrive. Cyrus Field and the Transatlantic cable, undersea cable in 1858. It was a marvelous invention. Now we no longer had to wait weeks or months to find out what's going on in Europe. We could find out within a matter of hours. It was phenomenal. We no longer were completely separate. We became more intermeshed, and we're starting to look more and more like a spaghetti dish. Westward Expansion. Got to get rid of those Indians. Get rid of them. And with these new methods of transportation and communication, it makes it a lot easier. And we start seeing what they call streams of migration from the lower South, from the upper South, from New England. And all of a sudden, with going west, we've got a lot of new resources that are opening up to us. You got cheap land. And that's one of the biggest motivating factors to move west is land, because all the better land around the coast, of course, is gone, been gone for 100 years. And the only way to move up in the world, meet the great American dream, is to get your own land. And because of it, we begin to see the rise of the cotton kingdom. So what contributed to all this? The demand for cotton. Why would you grow something that nobody wants? First in the United Kingdom and then in the U.S. Opening up the deep south to new settlement, all those new areas down there, Louisiana, Georgia, not Louisiana, Alabama, Texas. But because of this, there's going to be some consequences. They begin to see a regional economic specialization. And this is good to some. It revitalizes slavery, which is bad. You begin to see the growth, or shall we say the regrowth of domestic slave trade. Now, Eli Whitney, now I want to tell you a little bit more about him. Mr. Whitney was a young man from New England. In 1792, when he had just recently graduated from Yale, he wanted to become a lawyer. But like most of us who went to college today, we have debts to repay. So we need to get a job. And as much as he hated to, he left Massachusetts and took a position as a private tutor on a plantation in Georgia. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. While he was there, he learned that the southern planters were, well, they desperately needed a way to make profit from cotton. They had something called the long stem cotton, or long staple cotton, and it was very easy to separate its seeds, but unfortunately, it could only be grown along the coast. Now, there was another variety that grew inland, and it had sticky green seeds, and oh, it was so time-consuming to pick those seeds out of that fluffy white cotton ball. So he was encouraged to find a solution by his employer, a lady whose name was Catherine Greene, who was a widow of Revolutionary War hero General Greene. General Greene was the gentleman that George Washington gave the Southern Command to after the British went south. He was older and she was young, and he died, and now she's a widow with a plantation. And she gave him financial support and moral support. And the story goes that Eli fell in love with her. And yes, she was a little bit older than he was, but she was a rich, beautiful widow, for heaven's sakes. What more can you say? He did hope to patent his little piece of equipment he came up with. And it was a small gin when he first made it. It was kind of hand-cranked, and later larger versions would be made. Or you could be drawn by horses, or you could do it by water power. And what he wrote his father was 1 man and a horse would do more than 50 men with the old machine. And he was having trouble getting a patent on it, and so he tried to charge people to come into their plantation and make it for them, and they didn't like that, so they started making their own, claiming that they were new invention. And he died without ever getting a patent or making any money off of it. And there was no way he could have foreseen the ways in which this invention is going to change society for the worse. Of course, the most significant of those was the growth of slavery. Now, why would slavery grow when you've got a machine to make it picking the seeds out easier? Because now you need to plant more cotton. And you have to have people to plant it and to pick the cotton before it goes into the gin. So, inadvertently, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and this was before he came up with interchangeable parts, because he grows up a growth of slavery. And I say it's invented by a slave, and the idea for it was brought to him by a slave. Immigration and migration. Now, the internal migration, it shifts from the countrysides to the cities. And people in cities moved a lot more frequently than they used to. But then you've got other immigration. In the 1840s, the Irish famine in Ireland caused hundreds of thousands of people to migrate. In the 1850s, you had the German migration. And what pulled them? Cheap land, the ability to get a job, and quicker long-distance travel. It no longer took you so long. And like I said, you've got that undersea cable. You can know when you're going to get there. You've got political freedoms here you didn't have in Ireland or Germany. The push factors pushed them out of their countries, political unrest where they were. Like I say, the Irish famine, lack of any economic opportunity. Now, this is pretty much a breakdown now. The Irish were the largest majority of the immigrants that came in, and they stayed pretty much in the Northeast. And I'm trying to think by 1860, I think something like 50% of the population of Boston and Baltimore were Irish. The next one is German. And Great Britain, which was where the original colonists, it's kind of slacked off. And as you can see, Canada, we've got them from the rest of Europe. We got them from all over the place. But Irish and German were the most. And like I say, why did they come? Because of famine. Meanwhile, to get a good business going, you've got to have help. Now, although the government was not actively involved in the economy, they practiced what they call laissez-faire politics, which strictly means government hands-off. But they encouraged the development of private corporations, and although they're not investing in it at all, they're just not doing anything to stop it. Even the state governments are active in improving transportation and the infrastructure, which is going to improve business. They supported competition, and they supported private property, and a lot of court cases were settled in favor of the employer. They began to criminalize strikes. Like I say, very supportive of their employers. They sided with them totally. And they even put up protective tariffs in 1816, 24, and 28 to try to help the growing industries here in our country. But you got to create a business-friendly climate. You do that, we have the Supreme Court rulings, all pro-business, laissez-faire, which is basically, as I said, government hands-off. And what happened because of these changes? Very rapid economic growth, periods of boom and bust, the urbanization and the growth of large cities, and the way our labor is done is changing. And you begin to see organized labor. And you see the rise of something called nativism. And this is a word I don't think you'll find in the dictionary. It just strictly means if you're not 100% red, white, and blue. In other words, if you're African American, you're Hispanic, you're Indian, you're Irish, you're German, you're from Italy, you've got to be born in this country. And what they fail to realize is, of course, everybody was an immigrant to begin with. Commercialization of farming in the Northwest. And of course, you've got social and cultural responses to all these changes. Like I said, regional specialization. In the East, we're going to become very, very industrial. In the South, cotton and slavery. In the West, it's going to become the nation's breadbasket for both the North and the South because they're so busy growing cotton in the South and so busy with factories in the North, they haven't got time to go out and farm. As I said, boom and bust, as you can see. They call it government economic bubbles, temporary downshifts and upshifts. But it plays havoc with the common man, you and me. The price of a year's tuition in Harvard in 1790 was $24, but by 1860 had risen to $104. And I can vouch that it still continues into the 20th century because I know that in 1989, the tuition at the community college was $24 a credit unit. And in less than 15 years, it was over 90. Another 10 years, it's almost 150. The population centers in 1820, as you can see, they're mostly along the Northeast. You've got, about 50,000 down here in New Orleans. But Montgomery, you don't even see Atlanta. Charleston is teeny tiny, about 25,000. You've got one, it's said between 100 and 250,000. It's kind of hard to know for sure, and the census wasn't that reliable, and we had so many immigrants coming in. But even Boston's less than 50,000. Look what happens in a few years. Look how big New Orleans has grown, St. Louis, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Chicago, big, huge cities in the Midwest. But of course, the biggest one is New York City in the Northeast. And that's going to stay that way. But you've still got all this. Well, this is where the immigrants are coming in, too. And they're staying up here or going west. They're not coming to the South. Meanwhile, you're going to have changes in labor. As I pointed out, the artisan tradition is going to be shocked because, well, I guess you all do the same thing. I would love to have a beautiful hand-crocheted Irish shawl, but it's going to cost me an arm and a leg. And I can run down here to Wally World or Kmart and buy me a machine-made one for, just a few bucks. And it's not going to last, it's not going to be as pretty, but it's something I can afford. So the artisan trade is going to decline. And we who are working daily, we don't have any say about it. We don't have any freedom. We have to come in and punch a time clock, work our 8, 10, or 12 hours, maybe get a break for lunch if we're lucky. We're told what to do, when to do it, and even told what to do when we're not at work. And we all have those line jobs where you do the same thing all day long. You put the same peg in the same hole, and sometimes you don't even know what you're doing. I worked one place for 7 years in the accounting section, And I had no idea. We made one part for a bigger piece of machinery somewhere over in Europe. And we made money doing it, but I had no idea what it was. I just had to keep track of it. We've got a lot more supervision. We no longer know the boss or the man who owns the company. We've got a supervisor or overseer if you were a slave. And the time between work time and leisure time is really going to be very definite. In the beginning, when you lived on a farm, the sun and the weather determined when you worked. But now, like I said, you punch the time clock and you go in and you work your 6 or 7 days a week, and that's it. We shift from labor's price to labor's wage. And there's inversion to it. Of course there is. The women at the Lowell factories are eventually going to be replaced by cheaper immigrant labor because of the way things are going. I don't want my daughter or my wife working there. And as an employer, I can get that Irish or German immigrant at half the price the American worker is going to cost me. So, economics. The early union movement. A workman's party was formed in 1829 in New York City by Robert Dale Owen. But the early unions weren't usually so much a union. They were more social, and they really didn't have any power. But the workers' political parties were ineffective until after the Civil War. But some political organizations that get together are going to start, and they're kind of a combination political and union. They're going to demand free public education, an end to this imprisonment for debt, go to debtor's prison, limit the work hours to just 10 per day. And the wage earners are comparing their status to slaves, and they begin to call what they're making, taking home, their paycheck, as wage slavery. Rise of Nativism, which I told you was a word that you probably won't find in your textbook. Whenever you're frightened for your own livelihood, you've got to have somebody to blame it on. So I could have this job if that German or Irish immigrant wasn't here. And besides, which they're coming in, these people coming into our country, I mean, they're Catholic, they're Jewish, they're just not like us. And they're going to try to subvert our government. And they're against democratic ideas. They don't want kings and things like that. So anti-immigration riots and political campaigns began. And one of the most funny political parties that came to be because of this, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, this is showing the Irish girls working at Lowell. Now, I can testify, my grandfather was second generation Irish. He was one of the most fun-loving, hard-drinking men I've ever met in my life. And, of course, you get one Irishman and does this, and you're going to say all the Irish people are the same. Well, it's not. There's some Irish who don't drink, but the Irish are big drinkers. And they're wonderful people. And I love the Irish brogue. This is what I'm going to tell you about. The Know Nothing Party came about because of the immigrants. You'd ask them what they would do, what was their platform. They'd say, I know nothing. They were against everything. I mean, it was kind of an early KKK before KKK came into being. They wanted you to be 100% red, white, and blue, and that these people were foreign immigrants. They were after our jobs. And I don't know how they grew, but unfortunately, they did grow for a while. And we even had several governors elected on the Know Nothing Party. But the specialization and commercialization of farming in the Northwest. They're beginning to think more and more about the market. We can grow surplus. And to get better prices, maybe I just ought to stick to one crop, not try to grow a lot of things. Dry farming is in the West because you have to learn to grow crops that don't require a lot of water because you have very little rain in the West. Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma, very little rain. Pushed by the growth of eastern markets, transportation networks, and the availability of credit. This is the bane of the farmers right now. I may have a hell of a crop this year, but I have to use all the profits I've got. But I'm going to pay back what I borrowed from the bank last year. Improved farm machinery, especially after 1840s, like that steel plow. And the way you're working, like in 1820, 78% were in agriculture. It dropped drastically in 40 years. It dropped almost 20%. Look at this. Construction went up for a while in 1840 and then back down. Manufacturing is gangbusters. The service industry is growing. But the farming, less and less people are on the farm. So they have to grow more to feed more people with less people to do it. And the Second Great Awakening. It begins the last of the 1700s coming into the 1900s, 1800s, which is the 19th century. And some of the ministers are preaching hellfire and brimstone, and some are preaching of the forgiveness of God, which is just almost a duplicate of what happened in the first awakening. They're stressing private judgment and the possibility of salvation through faith and good works. In other words, St. Peter's standing at the pearly gates and he's got this big old journal up there and he's keeping track. Oh, you did this and you did that. They have what they call camp meetings. And unless you've ever been to a revival camp meeting, I think it's the Methodists that do it more than the Baptists. It's very emotional. It usually lasts a week and you go away. You're not at the church. You go away to a place. Industrialization frightens some. And yeah, when you see your whole life crumbling, it's like people in my generation, when the computers first came in, we were sure we were going to cost us a lot of jobs. One computer could do the work of 3 or 4 people. You didn't need typists because you had, spell check and things in your computer. And we didn't realize that with the advent of computers and all the technology, we were increasing the need for people to work. Yes, my computer does some wonderful things that I couldn't do when I first started working. And I much prefer using word processing than I did using the old manual typewriters. But there's something to be said. You can sit and work on your computer all day long, and what have you got to show for it except something on a little floppy disk or a little hard drive? But when you used to sit and type all day, when you got through, you had a desk full of papers that you had typed. I'm telling my age, yeah, I'm sorry. And you're looking for solace, something to make it okay. The Baptist and the Methodist denominations grew rapidly. The Methodists grew the most at this time. But even the Catholics and the Jewish population saw an increase. We're looking for something. Oh, now this is a hard one. Distribution of wealth. During the American Revolution, almost half of all the wealth in the country was in the top 10% of the population, which are basically our founding fathers. By 1845, in Boston, the top 4% of the population owned over 65% of the wealth. And it gets worse. 1860 in Philadelphia, the top 1% owns over 50% of the wealth. So this gap between the rich and the poor is widening here, between the haves and the have-nots. The unequal distribution of the wealth. The Great American Dream. A German visitor in the 1840s by the name of Frederick List observed that anything new is quickly introduced here, including all the latest inventions. There's no clinging to the old ways. The moment an American hears the word invention, he picks up his ears. And that's even today. I mean, look at the people standing in line to buy the new phones. And my daughter-in-law is one of the worst. As soon as something new comes on the market, she's got to have it. But who are the beneficiaries of all these changes? Did African Americans benefit? No. Discrimination. They were being barred from schools, public facilities. They got the lowest paying job if they could get one at all. And in a lot of cases, they were not allowed to move west because some of your friendly western states did not welcome them. They created their own businesses and their own churches and tried to build their own communities. What about American women? For the most part, no. Some women factory workers, yes. But that was usually the immigrants. The role for the one was to stay home and provide shelter from the rigors of daily life for the man. And Republican motherhood was replaced by something called the cult of domesticity. I love that. And the perceived idea is, one, women are virtuous. We're very sexually innocent. We're beautiful and frail. And we're very dependent upon men to take care of us and protect us. And we're seen as nurturing and selfless. And of course, we're ruled by emotion, especially during certain times of the month. And we were not allowed in the public sphere. We had to remain confined to the home. Was that the reality? Well, for a few upper class, yes. But for the lower and lower class, the women worked outside the home in very low-paying jobs. They couldn't sign a contract. If they got divorced, their husbands got custody of the children. If they did work, usually the husband picked up the paycheck. Now, there were some middle-class women. You're getting to see a growing middle-class society developing, and some middle-class women, primarily because the husband, he wasn't that concerned about his wife doing housework. He just wanted to appear to be successful, and the best way to appear to be successful is to have some help for his wife, for the household duties. So many Americans experience the market revolution as a loss of freedom. We can no longer call our time our own. We're being told what to do by the boss at jobs. We're being told what to do by the church at home. What happened to all this freedom we had this revolution for? So many Americans saw opportunities in industrialization, yes, to get a paycheck. But it's going to generate a lot of protests and a lot of anxieties. Now, this is the one YouTube I've got, and I love the way Mr. Green tells you about things. He's just going to reiterate basically what I've told you, but in his own unique fashion. After we see our ad.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we return to one of my favorite subjects, economics. Mr. Green, I don't want to brag, but economics is actually my best subject. Like, I got the bronze medal at the state academic decathlon tournament among C students. Yeah, I remember me from the past. By the way, thanks for getting that picture into our show. It just goes to show you aptitude is not destiny. Anyway, economics is about much more than like supply and demand curves. Ultimately, it's about the decisions people make and how those decisions shape their lives and the world. So today we're going to turn to one of the least studied but most interesting periods in American history, the market revolution. There weren't any fancy wars or politically charged debates, but this discussion shaped the way that most Americans actually live their lives and think about work on a daily basis. Like, if you or someone you know goes to work, well, then you have the market revolution to thank, or possibly to curse. The market revolution, like the Industrial Revolution, was more of a process than an event. It happened in the first half of the 19th century, basically the period before the Civil War. This was the so-called era of good feelings, because between 1812 and 1836, there was really only one political party, making American politics, much less contentious, also more boring. The market revolution saw many Americans move away from producing stuff largely for themselves on independent farms, that Jeffersonian ideal, and toward producing goods for sale to others, often others who were very far away, with prices set by competition with other producers. This was closer to Hamilton's American dream. In the end, buddy, you didn't get to be president, but you did win. In many ways, this was the beginning of the modern commercial industrial economy, not just in the United States, but in the world. The first thing that enabled this massive economic shift was new technology, specifically in transportation and communication. Like in the 18th century, it was very difficult to bring goods to markets, and that meant that markets were local and small. Most trade was overland, and transporting goods 30 miles overland in the United States literally cost as much as shipping them to England. So to get something from Cincinnati to New York, for instance, the most efficient way was to go down the Mississippi River, through the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, and then up the Atlantic coast, which took 3 months. But that was still less time and less money than more direct overland routes. But new transportation changed this. First came better roads, which were largely financed by tolls. Even the federal government got in on the act, building the so-called National Road, which reached all the way from the massive city of Cumberland, Maryland, across our great nation to the equally metropolitan Wheeling, West Virginia. Mr. Green, I know me from the past. West Virginia did not yet exist. Shut up. More important than roads were canals, which made transport much cheaper and more efficient, and which wouldn't have been possible without the steamboat. Robert Fulton's steamboat Claremont first sailed from New York to Albany in 1807, demonstrating the potential of steam-powered commerce, and by 1811, there were steamboats on the Mississippi. The introduction of steamboats set off a mania for canal building. Between 1800 and the Depression of 1837, which put a halt to most construction, more than 3,000 miles of canals were built. And no state was more instrumental in the canal boom than New York, which in 1825 completed the 363-mile-long Erie Canal, linking the Great Lakes with the Hudson River, which made New York the nation's premier port. Other cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse grew up along the canal, so much so that Nathaniel Hawthorne once said that canal is like fertilizer, causing cities to spring up alongside it. That's such a good simile, Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's almost like the United States didn't have any good writers until Mark Twain, but we need to read somebody from the early 19th century, so I guess it's you. But from a long-term perspective, the most important new transportation? Railroads. The first commercial railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, was begun in 1828, and by 1860 there were more than 30,000 miles of rails in the United States. And on the communication side, we got the telegraph, so no longer would Andrew Jackson fight battles 2 weeks after the end of a war. Telegraphs allowed merchants to know when to expect their shipments and how much they could expect to sell them for, and then, as now, more information meant more robust markets. But perhaps the most important innovation of the time was the factory. Now, when you think of factories, you might think of, like, Chinese political prisoners prisoners making smartphones, but early factories looked like this. More than just a technological development, the factory was an organizational innovation. Like, factories gathered workers together in one place and split up tasks among them, making production much faster and also more efficient. The first factories relied on water power, which is the reason they were all east of the fall line, the geographic reason why there are so many waterfalls and rapids on the East Coast. But after 1840, steam power was introduced, so factories could be located in other places, especially near the large cities that were sprouting up in what we now know as the Midwest. So the American system of manufacture, which centered on mass production of interchangeable parts, grew up primarily in New England, but then it moved to the Midwest, where it spent its adolescence and its adulthood, and now its tottering decline into senility. So all these new economic features, roads, canals, railroads, telegraphs, factories, they all required massive upfront capital investment. Like, you just can't build a canal in stages as it pays for itself. So without more modern banking systems and people willing to take risks, none of this would have happened. Some of these investments were facilitated by new business organizations, especially the Limited Liability Corporation, which enabled investors to finance business ventures without being personally responsible for losses other than their own. In other words, corporations can fail without, like, ruining their stockholders and directors. People don't always like that, by the way, but it's been very good for economic growth in the last 180 years or so. So having angered a bunch of people by talking about the important role that big businesses played in growing the American economy in the 19th century, I will now anger the rest of you by talking about the important role that the state played. In the 1830s, states began passing general incorporation laws, which made it easier to create corporations, and the Supreme Court upheld them and protected them from further interference in cases like Gibbons versus Ogden, which struck down a monopoly that New York had granted to one steamboat company, and the Charles River Bridge case, which said that building a second bridge over the Charles River did not infringe upon the charter of the first bridge. In both those cases, the court was using its power to encourage competition. And this brings up something really important about the growth of American capitalism. Government helped. The federal government built roads and canals, and its highest court protected businesses, and states issued bonds to build canals and offered sweetheart deals to companies that built railroads. And despite what we may believe about the heroic risk-taking entrepreneurs building the American economy through solitary efforts, without the government protecting their interests, they wouldn't have been able to do much. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The market revolution changed the landscape of work, which for most of the prior 200 years happened at home. Small-scale production of clothes and other goods had been done in the home, largely by women, and initially, this is how industrial production worked as well. Factory owners would produce some of the products, like patterns for shoes, and then farm the finishing out to people working in their houses. Eventually, they realized that it would be more efficient to gather the workers together in one place. Although the older putting out system continued in some industries, especially in big cities, after the market revolution, more and more Americans went to work instead of working from home. The market revolution also changed the way we imagined work and leisure time. Like, on farms, the seasons and hours of daylight regulated the time for work, but in factories, work is regulated by the clock, which, by the way, was one of the first products to be manufactured using the American system of manufacturing. Railroads and shipping timetables further required the standardization of time. Factories also made it possible for more people to do industrial work. At first, this meant women. The workers in the early textile mills at Lowell, Massachusetts, for instance, were primarily young New England farm girls who worked for a few years in the mills before returning home to get married. Women were cheaper to employ because it was assumed that they would not be a family's sole breadwinner. At least this was the excuse for not paying them more at the time. I can't remember what excuse we have now, but I'm sure it's a great one. Anyway, all of this meant that the nature of work had changed. In colonial America, artisans worked for what they called their price, which was linked to what they produced. In a factory, however, workers were paid a wage according to the number of hours they worked, regardless of how much they produced. This may not sound like a big deal, but working for wages with one's livelihood defined by a clock and the whims of an employer was a huge change, and it undermined the idea of freedom that was supposedly the basis of America. Thomas Jefferson had worried that men working in factories dependent upon their employers were inherently unfree, and that this would make them unfit to be proper American citizens. And as it happens, many factory workers agreed with him. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So one reaction to the restrictions of the wage worker was to engage in the great American pastime of lighting out for the territories. With less and less farmland available in New England, young men had been migrating west for decades, and after the War of 1812, this flood of migration continued and even grew. Between 1790 and 1840, 4.5 million people crossed over the Appalachian Mountains, and 6 new states were created between 1815 and 1821. Ohio's population grew from 231 roughly 1,000 in 1810 to over 2 million by 1850. People even took up the motto, malaria isn't going to catch itself, and moved to Florida after we purchased it from Spain in 1819. Moving out west was a key aspect of American freedom, and the first half of the 19th century became the age of manifest destiny, the idea that it was a God-given right of Americans to spread out over the North American continent. The term was coined by a New York journalist, John L. O'Sullivan, who wrote that the people living out west, i.e. the Native Americans, must succumb to, quote, our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment in liberty. Stan, he actually wrote overspread. One thing I love about Providence is it has like a 100% rate of give a thing unto us and take a thing away from them. One of the results of this migration was that it was really difficult for factory owners to find men who could work in their factories. First, they looked to Yankee women to fill the factories, but increasingly, those jobs were filled by immigrants. Fortunately, the U.S. had lots of immigrants, like the more than 1 million Irish people who came here fleeing poverty, especially after the potato famine of 1845 to 1851. Lastly, let's turn to the intellectual responses to the market revolution. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. And yes, this is a real shock pen. Lots of people are commenting saying I am faking the shocks. I am not faking the shocks. I am in the business of teaching you history, not in the business of faking pain. All right, let's do this thing. They do not yet see, and thousands of young men as hopeful now crowding to the barriers of the career do not yet see, that if the single man plant himself indomitably on his instincts and there abide, the huge world will come round to him. Patience, patience with the shades of all the good and great for company, and for solace the perspectives of your own infinite life, and for work the study and the communication of principles, the making those instincts prevalent, the conversion of the world. Is it not the chief disgrace in the world not to be a unit, not to be reckoned one character, not to yield that peculiar fruit which each man was created to bear, but to be, oh God, Stan, I can't bear it anymore. It's Emerson. It's definitely Emerson. It is unreadably Emerson. Indeed, the most linguistically convoluted of the Transcendentalists, which is really saying something. Anyway, I don't get punished, but I did kind of get half punished because I had to read that. The Transcendentalists, like Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, were trying to redefine freedom in a changing world. Work was increasingly regimented, factory workers were as interchangeable as the parts that they made, but the Transcendentalists argued that freedom resided in an individual's power to remake oneself, and maybe even the world. But there would be a reaction to this in American literature, as it became clear that escaping drudgery to reinvent yourself was no easy task for wage workers. So the early 19th century saw a series of booms and busts, sometimes called business cycles, and with those business cycles came a growing disparity in wealth. To protect their interests, workers began forming political organizations called Workingman's parties that eventually morphed into unions calling for higher wages and better working conditions. And we'll have more to say about that in coming weeks, but for now it's important to remember that as America grew more prosperous, many people, women and especially slaves, but also free wage working men, recognized that the market revolution left them with much less freedom than they might have enjoyed 50 or 100 years earlier. My favorite commentary on the market revolution actually comes from the author Herman Melville in his short story Bartleby the Scrivener. Melville worked at the Customs House in New York, so he knew all about world markets firsthand. In Bartleby, he tells the story of a young clerk who works for a lawyer in New York City. Now, when you're a farmer, your work has intrinsic meaning. When you work, you have food, and when you don't work, you don't. But when you're a copyist like Bartleby, it's difficult to find meaning in what you do every day. You know that anyone else could do it, and you suspect that if your work doesn't get done, it won't actually matter very much. And in light of this, Bartleby just stops working, saying, I prefer not, when asked, well, pretty much anything. Seeing his boss and society's reaction to someone who simply doesn't buy into the market economy is comic and then ultimately tragic, and it tells us a lot about the market revolution beyond the famous people and inventions and heroic individualism. Now, most people read Bartleby as an existentialist narrative, and it definitely is that, but for me, the story's subtitle proves that it's also about the market economy. The full title of the story is Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Mower. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Lowell Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you have questions about today's video, please ask them in comments, where they'll be